Well, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, How to Pick Your Newspaper, Selection, Resources, and Workflows for Newspaper Digitization. I'm Biz Gallo, the Statewide Digitization Initiatives Coordinator for the Library of Michigan. And my job is to help libraries and cultural heritage organizations throughout Michigan digitize their collections, make them accessible, and preserve them over time. After laying the foundation for digitizing collections in last year's 9-part Digitization Basics webinar series, which you can view on YouTube, we're going to dive a little bit deeper this year into the How to Pick series. And this series is going to cover a variety of topics like format-specific classes, such as digitizing newspapers, which we're doing today, digitizing scrapbooks and audiovisual material, resource-centered classes such as working with vendors, working with interns and volunteers, and building a community archives, and procedural classes such as writing digitization grant applications and creating digital exhibits. As always, if there's any particular topics you're interested in learning more about, let me know so I can continue to provide you with the resources you need to care for your digital collections. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded, so you can access the content again later along with a copy of the slides. The recording should be available in about a week, allowing time for captioning. But if you miss any of the classes in the series, you can always view the recordings by going to the Library of Michigan's webinar archive. There will be time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to drop questions in the chat throughout the webinar. If you have any technical or audio issues, please reach out to Becky in the chat so that she can help resolve them. And last, you will receive a copy of the slides, and it is going to have links to all the resources I mentioned today, so you don't have to scramble to try to look things up or write them down, but you can always explore the many additional resources on the digitization page of the Library of Michigan's website. I would just like to put out a disclaimer. We're going to be talking a lot about copyright today. So the research, resources, and discussion that are part of today's presentation are for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing legal advice. You should contact your attorney to obtain advice with respect to any particular issue or problem. Claire would never forgive me if I didn't say that. Great. Well, today we're going to be looking at inventory and selection of newspapers, digitization planning and workflows for newspapers, and then we're going to wrap up with some funding opportunities and ways to pay for your newspaper digitization project. Now, as always, before we dive in, I like to start with a poll. So for those of you who are here, I'd love to know if you are providing access to newspapers in your collections, how are you doing so? And you can select all that apply. There's bound paper, microfilm. You have a digital version that's in-house only, digital version that you host, a digital version that a vendor hosts for you, or maybe you don't provide any access, and that's why you're here today, to find out how to. Great. Well, it looks like we have actually a good mix of access options. Lots of people still providing access to the bound paper and the microfilm, with a few people providing access to digital versions. Great. Well, thank you for providing that information. It's always good to know where people are starting from, how they're providing access, and we can talk about how to improve that. Great. All right, so we are going to go ahead and start with inventory and selection of newspapers. We all know that newspapers can be found in public libraries everywhere. And while library patrons use newspapers to learn about current events, both local and abroad, historic newspapers also have value to researchers, whether they are exploring something specific, like their genealogy, or broader, like trends over time. Now, unfortunately, newspapers are fragile. They're printed on paper meant to last only as long as the news was relevant. This causes an issue for researchers who are unable to access deteriorating newspaper. To help preserve content over time, newspapers were often bound into volumes, and starting in the 1930s, they were put on microfilm, not only for preservation, but also for condensed storage. You can see in this picture the size difference between the microfilm reel sitting on top of the newsprint it contains. Now, currently, libraries are faced with a new barrier to providing access to newspapers. Microfilm machines are becoming harder to repair and replace, and patrons are more comfortable navigating the digital world than handling a microfilm reader. This change has led to an increased interest in and need for newspaper digitization at public libraries. Now, there are many factors to consider before starting a newspaper digitization project, from knowing what you have to understanding how to preserve those files over time. This presentation will guide you through the process of deciding whether and how to digitize your newspapers, utilizing the many Michigan-specific resources available. Now, the first step in any digitization project is to know what you have. If you plan to digitize your newspapers, not only will you need to provide information to a vendor in order to get an accurate cost estimate for the project, but also for your own assessment of a newspaper's copyright status, and therefore your ability to digitize and provide access to that paper. You can start with just a simple spreadsheet listing the title and other relevant information. Now, I've included a sample newspaper inventory template in the resources for this presentation, so you can copy that and adapt it for your own use. For each title, you should note the format. You should note whether this is bound newsprint or if it's microfilm. Do you have access to both? There will be a significant cost difference between digitizing from print and digitizing from microfilm. You'll need to know what the extent is, such as how many pages if it's print or how many reels if it's microfilm. You'll want to know the publication date and the publication frequency. This is going to help you research the newspaper's copyright status and make additional estimates based on the number of pages. You'll want to note the condition, such as whether this paper is particularly brittle or if the microfilm is deteriorating. Last, be sure to include any other relevant notes, such as if there's misprints or missing issues. And once you know what you have, you can move on to determining whether what you have should be digitized. As with all digitization projects, not everything could or even should be digitized. Before moving ahead, you can assess your newspaper collection for digitization suitability. The Library of Congress recommends determining whether a newspaper title should be selected for microfilming and digitization by assessing its research value, physical condition, and completeness. In terms of research value, assess whether this paper has historical significance. Is this content consistently requested by researchers for access? Is this content already available elsewhere or maybe in alternate editions? Digitizing newspapers is a time and cost-intensive process, so make every effort to be sure that there is a sufficient demand for the final product. In terms of physical condition, you'll need to ensure that the paper is stable enough to either be digitized or microfilmed without damaging the original. Consider whether the quality of the microfilm is sufficient to create a readable digital surrogate. Digitization cannot improve a bad microfilming job or replace torn or weak newsprint. Digital images should be taken from the best quality version available, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in later slides. Last, completeness. Is the content complete or are there several issues missing? Due to the nature of newspapers, anything less than reasonably complete makes for unsatisfactory use. If your collection is incomplete, are you able to collaborate with other organizations to combine material and complete a run if necessary? Now, if a newspaper title has been assessed and it's found to have significant research value, has sufficient quality, and is relatively complete, it sounds like a good candidate for digitization, which would lead you to the next step. Now, as we've mentioned, digitization requires many resources. So before you spend your limited ones on digitizing newspapers, confirm that the newspaper is not already digitized and available online elsewhere. The Clark Historical Library at Central Michigan University has developed the Digital Michigan Newspaper Portal, a comprehensive list of digitized versions of Michigan newspapers to help with research. Chronicling America is another great resource for researching U.S. newspapers. This website provides access to information about historic newspapers and select digitized newspaper pages. It is constantly being updated, so you can always check back. Once you've selected a newspaper title as a candidate for digitization, check these available resources to see if the newspaper has already been digitized somewhere. If it has already been digitized by another institution, please don't digitize it again. There's no need to digitize the newspaper in your collection simply so you can have access to it. You can simply point researchers to the digitized version. Now, if the newspaper is behind a paywall, which it might be, you may very well be able to access it through one of the many online databases that are available for public library and Library of Michigan cardholders. If the newspaper has been partially digitized, this may be a great opportunity to fill in those gaps and collaborate with another organization. Digitization is a naturally collaborative process, so this is a great opportunity to start the conversation and identify ways to work together. Now, if the newspaper doesn't appear to be digitized already, you might want to double check the newspaper family histories page from the Library of Michigan to confirm whether the paper you have was published under a different title at one point in time, and maybe that's what it's being posted under or registered under. If you confirm that the newspaper has not been digitized at all, it's a good idea to proceed to assessing whether you have the right to digitize this paper. Before digitizing anything, you should assess its copyright status. What is copyright? Copyright is a type of intellectual property that protects original works of authorship as soon as an author affixes the work in a tangible form of expression. Now, copyright balances this protection of creators and the benefits of the work for society as a whole. This is where you might think about fair use and the preservation and reproduction sections of copyright code coming into play. Now, while copyright does provide rights to the author or the copyright holder regarding how their works can be used, these rights are not indefinite. The length of copyright protection will depend on several factors, including when a work was created and whether or not it was published, registered, or renewed. Now, once copyright has expired or work has been placed in the public domain, works can be used freely. It's essential to perform this copyright assessment on any newspaper title you plan to digitize and provide access to in order to protect both your organization from litigation and from infringing on the intellectual property rights of others. This is especially important if you are not the copyright owner. You can start by creating a simple spreadsheet, or you can go ahead and add to the newspaper inventory to document your findings. Currently, as in 2023 for the next few weeks, anything published before 1928 is in the public domain. Now, in a few weeks, when we enter 2024, anything published before 1929 will be in the public domain. Each year on January 1st, copyright protections expire for materials published 95 years ago. Now, this is great because any newspaper published before 1928 can be digitized, shared, and used freely. You don't need to do any more research into that material. I'd also like to note that this is for published material. If you are looking for unpublished material, they have other copyright terms and conditions. Now, for items published in 1928 going forward, the copyright status is a little bit harder to determine. For works published between 1928 and 1977, you'll need to do some additional research. If a newspaper was published during this time period without a copyright notice, the work is in the public domain. Works that fall into this category, meaning were published in that time period without a copyright notice, they are in the public domain and they can be digitized, shared, and used freely. Now, if a newspaper was published between 1928 and 1963 with a copyright notice, you would need to do some additional research to determine whether or not the copyright was renewed with the Copyright Office. So starting with either the year the paper was published or the last year the paper could have been in the public domain, you would want to search the catalog of copyright entries to identify the title, whether the title was either registered with the Copyright Office and or the copyright registration was renewed. The catalog of copyright entries is a list from the Library of Congress of all of the copyright registrations, and it has been scanned and is freely available online. It is full text searchable. It does require some legwork, but it is available, so I would highly recommend going through the process. Now, if you go through that and discover that the copyright was not renewed, that work is then in the public domain. If it's in the public domain, it can be digitized, shared, and used freely. If the newspaper was published with a copyright notice and the copyright was renewed, The work is still covered by copyright and will remain under copyright for 95 years after the publication date. Now, if the newspaper was published between 1964 and 1977 with a copyright notice, the work is still covered by copyright and will remain under copyright for 95 years after publication date. Yeah, that time period between 1928 and 1977 is pretty confusing, but there are lots of resources to go through and kind of, flow chart your way to figuring out where things are. But things get a lot easier in 1978. So if a newspaper was published in 1978 or after, the work is automatically covered by copyright. And they didn't need to register it or renew it. Everything after then that is published or created is automatically covered by copyright. The work will remain under copyright protection for 95 years after the publication date. Now, again, I know this is confusing. This is a lot of dates and data. I'm not expecting you to memorize this or have it at the tip of your tongue, but you will need to know where to look to find this information. And again, there are many copyright resources in the resource section of the slides, so feel free to explore those. So with any digitization project, there will be levels of risk, and it's up to you and your own organization to determine the level of acceptable risk. However, there are definitely things you can do to help mitigate your risk levels. First, as you perform the copyright assessment, be sure to document your overall workflow and the data points that led to your determination, such as an item's publication date, what you think its copyright status is, what the copyright expiration year is, who you think the copyright owner is, and either evidence of permission from the copyright owner or your attempts to contact the copyright owner. If there's ever litigation surrounding copyright infringement of the work, this documentation can be used to show the intent to be a good actor in respect to intellectual property rights. Next, assess the newspaper as a whole. Something to be aware of when providing access to digitized newspaper content is that most papers contain syndicated or separately copyrighted content, such as advertisements, serialized fiction, and comic strips, which may have different copyright protections than the rest of the paper. The Library of Congress's policy for the National Digital Newspaper Program has generally been that if this copyrighted material is contained within the context of a newspaper, which is otherwise in the public domain, it's acceptable to digitize and provide access to the material as long as it makes up less than 50% of the entire work. Now, this is, of course, a policy and common practice, but it is not law and not something that would indemnify you if it ever went to court. Now, if a newspaper title is still protected under copyright, that doesn't mean you can't digitize it. You have multiple paths to move forward. First, you can attempt to contact the publisher of the newspaper or the copyright holder and request permission to digitize and provide access to the newspapers in your collection. If you do receive permission from the copyright holder, create and maintain documentation of their permission to digitize and provide access to your collection with your administrative records. Now, another thought is that if a newspaper is still being published, you either have or could develop a relationship with that publisher, and you might be able to request digital versions of the newspaper directly. Now, many newspapers are now born digital, meaning that they were created on a computer, sent directly to print or hosting online from a computer. And by working directly with the publisher, you can circumvent the costly process of digitization and request a PDF or another format version to be shared directly and saved on your storage. Now, we all know that identifying and contacting publishers can be difficult, especially as several publishers of local newspapers are now defunct or they may have been acquired by large conglomerates, which really aren't happy to share. So if you're unable to identify or contact the copyright holder to request permission, you may still decide to digitize and make newspaper available under fair use. Now, fair use is the legal doctrine that promotes freedom of expression by permitting the unlicensed use of copyright protected works in certain circumstances, such as for criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Now, Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Act provides a statutory framework for determining whether something qualifies as fair use. Now, if you plan on digitizing something under copyright, you can see how this would hold up against a fair use test, which is a four-part framework to determine whether the use of work is considered fair use. The first is the purpose of that use. Is the use for commercial purposes, or is it for nonprofit educational purposes? If it's for commercial use, it's probably not a great fair use case. If it's for educational or nonprofit uses, it's a point towards fair use. Also consider the nature of the work used. Is this creative work, or is this more factual? Creative work leans more towards not fair use. Factual or data points point more towards fair use. 3, the amount or substantiality of the work used. Is it only a small portion of the work, or is it the work in its entirety? So if it's just a small portion, it leans more towards fair use. If it's the work in entirety, it points towards not being fair use. And last, the effect of the use upon the potential market value for the work. So does this hurt the copyright owner's ability to profit from their work, or does it not really have a big market impact? If it doesn't have a big market impact, then it leans more towards fair use. Now, again, fair use is not a free pass to digitize and provide access to things however you'd like, but rather it's a legal defense if there is ever litigation. So just as with other parts of your copyright assessment, be sure to document your fair use analysis and how you made that determination. Now, once you've performed your copyright assessment and determined whether and by whom copyright is held for the work, you can determine whether to move forward. Consult the stakeholders and legal counsel if the work is not clearly in the public domain and or you are not the rights holder of the work to be digitized to determine your risk level. There will always be some risk involved with digitization, but it's up to you and your organization to determine the level of risk you're comfortable with. All right, I'm going to ask for a little bit of interactivity, and we're going to do some practice on just a few newspapers. Obviously we have limited information about these, but based on the information we have, I hope that you will participate and answer. So we have 3 newspapers. The first newspaper is the Ishpeming Iron Ore. It was published in 1889. The copyright was never registered or renewed. Now, what do you all think this is? Is it in the public domain? Is it under copyright, or do we still need more information? Excellent. I'm going to, let's see. One person answered in copyright. Okay, well, the answer is the public domain. This paper is in the public domain due to copyright expiration. Remember, this was published in 1889, and anything published before 1928 is now in the public domain and can be digitized and used freely. All right, I'm curious to see, I'm going to try relaunching the poll because we're going to do another one. All right, so now we have the Morenci Observer. This was published in 1981, and the copyright, it was never registered with the Copyright Office or renewed. Is this in the public domain? Is it under copyright, or do we need more information? Okay. We've got guesses all across the board here. We've got some public domain, some in copyright, and some need more information. Okay. Well, this is covered under copyright as it was published after 1977. And remember that anything published after 1977 is automatically covered by copyright without having to register. So it doesn't matter that they never registered or renewed copyright. Now, this is under copyright for 95 years from publication, so it's not going to enter the public domain until 2076. I would like to note that all of the Morenci Observer has been digitized and is available freely online. Just because something's under copyright, that doesn't mean that you can't provide access to it. Again, this is a great example of the publisher being willing to provide access to their material. All right, we're going to do this one more time. Okay. Last one. Cadillac Evening News, published in 1951. The copyright wasn't registered or renewed. Public domain, in copyright, or need more information. Okay. Well, this paper is in the public domain due to failure to comply with required formalities. So this is published in 1951. Anything published 1928 through 1963 would need to have been registered with the Copyright Office in order to be covered. So because it wasn't, it is in the public domain and it can be digitized and shared freely. Great. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that you're all willing to participate and put yourselves out there. And this is hard. This is why there are specialists. I am not a copyright specialist. I don't personally know too many copyright specialists. So this is why we have a lot of resources and we ask questions and we help each other out. All right. Now that we've decided what we're going to be digitizing, we're going to move on to how to do it. So you've determined that you're able to digitize this newspaper, either due to its copyright status, receiving permission from the copyright holder, or you've determined that you're going to use the fair use argument. It's time to move forward with your planning. Now, depending on what formats you have, either microfilm or newspaper, you can decide how to move forward. In general, you would want to digitize from microfilm rather than print. Although you can digitize directly from print, digitizing microfilm is usually a cheaper and faster alternative. But not all microfilm is the same. There are several generations of microfilm, and it's important to use the best generation. The first generation, also called the Archive Master, is the version directly from the camera. This is the highest quality and also irreplaceable version of the film. From this first generation, a second generation print master or print negative is created. And from the print master, the third generation or service copies are created. If possible, scan from the second generation of microfilm. This is a negative, and negative film generally has less noise than positive print, which can cause issues when running optical character recognition on the scans. Now, service copies would produce poor scans, and they have a lower success rate in OCR due to the additional noise from being a positive print, as well as the scratches caused by frequent patron use. Now, this is just a guide, and you should be able to assess the microfilm's condition. So if the condition of the microfilm is poor, you might want to reconsider. The condition of the microfilm can have a huge impact on its resulting digital version. It took several decades for microfilm newspapers to be standardized, and even after the creation of standards, human error can lead to poor microfilm. If a film is out of focus, has poor lighting, or is heavily skewed, you may not be able to capture content through digitization for sufficient use. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. A vendor should be able to assess the newspaper and determine whether it's suitable for digitization and optical character recognition. Now, if you only have paper or your microfilm is a service copy in poor condition, explore whether another organization or the original microfilming company has the master copy of the microfilm that you could borrow or duplicate to use in your own digitization project. Now, if you only have access to the paper, decide whether you will microfilm and digitize or digitize only. Some vendors can only work from microfilm versions and would need to microfilm first and then digitize the microfilmed version, while others can digitize directly from the newspaper. Most vendors would prefer to digitize directly from microfilm, but it's a discussion to have with your vendor about their capabilities. Now, if the vendor can digitize directly from newspaper, you'll need to decide whether to digitize only or to microfilm and digitize. It should be stated that microfilm is still considered the preservation format for newspaper content, so it is still beneficial to microfilm your paper, but it is a choice that you'll have to make. And this brings us to vendors. Newspaper digitization is a challenging process that is most often contracted out to a vendor. It requires specialized equipment and expertise to not only digitize, but also create the appropriate metadata for management and discovery. If you plan to digitize in-house, consider whether you have the resources such as staff time, expertise, and equipment to digitize to standards and best practices. When looking for a vendor, there are several resources available to help you identify potential digitization partners. There are vendors located in Michigan that microfilm and digitize newspapers, as well as many vendors nationally. Now, a Google search will return hundreds of newspaper digitization vendors at varying levels of cost and technical ability. But I would highly encourage reaching out to peer organizations in order to solicit recommendations for vendors that have experience working with the cultural heritage sector. Now, you can do this by utilizing listservs such as Mich-Libel or the Mid-Michigan Digital Practitioners listserv. Alternatively, you could browse already aggregated vendor lists from a variety of sources, such as the Digital Library Federation's vendor registry or no reservation recommendations. You could also reach out directly to colleagues that you know have undertaken similar products in the past. This can often be the best way to identify potential vendors, as your colleagues can also give you a firsthand account of their experiences. Colleagues are unlikely to recommend vendors with whom they had a negative experience, and they can flag any particular issues that they have had in similar projects. Once you've identified potential digitization vendors, request proposals or quotes from at least 3 vendors. This will allow you to compare price, deliverables, and communication practices. Now, if this is your first time working with a digitization vendor, I highly encourage you to watch the How to Pick Your Partner Working with Digitization Vendors webinar. This webinar will give you an overview of the process of picking digitization vendors. I will mention here that you should be sure to check references, not just ask for them, and if possible, do a test batch or pilot to confirm specifications, quality, and communication. Now, most vendors will provide a sample scan at little or no cost, and I would highly recommend doing this once you've decided on a vendor or even just narrowed it down. By doing a sample scan, both you and the vendor can have a more accurate idea of what the project is going to entail, including the quality and orientation of the original microfilming. Now, some newspapers have multiple pages microfilmed in the same frame, which may have an impact on the overall workflow and cost of a digitization project. And knowing this ahead of time will be key. Now, regardless of which vendor you select, there are several considerations you'll need to take into account. You'll need to determine, as we talked about before, whether you're going to microfilm and digitize or just digitize. Remember, microfilm is a preservation format for newspapers, so I would still recommend planning on microfilming and then digitization if at all possible. You should explore what the cost differences and implications are for those 2 choices. Remember that once you digitize, you now have more material to preserve, not just the physical items, you now have the digital items. So how will that impact your overall project and infrastructure? You'll need to determine if the cost is per frame or per page. Some newspapers were microfilmed with a full 2-page spread. If it is a 2-page spread, you'll want to find out if there are costs to split those images into the individual pages, which we'll talk about in a second. Also, for those of you, I know you responded that a lot of you are still providing access to newspapers that are bound in volumes. If that's the only thing you have, or you're going to be submitting that to get microfilmed and then digitized, are you okay with that being disbound? Some people are not okay with that, but it can really limit the quality of your microfilm and therefore your resulting digital files. You'll also need to confirm what files you're receiving and do they meet preservation standards. So is the vendor able to meet the technical standards that you need them to? You'll also want to understand what the cost includes. Is this for digitization only? Is it digitization and optical character recognition? Is it digitization, OCR, and metadata? Are they doing deskewing or other adjustments? Just make sure that you understand what all is included. Different things mean different things to vendors. So making sure that you understand what you're asking for, what you need, and then checking what you got. This is going to be especially important when you're talking about quality control. You should find out what level of quality control the vendor is going to perform. And then you should also know what the procedure is if files that you receive from the vendor fail quality control standards. As you move on and you get the files back, you'll need to know whether you're going to have the vendor host the files or if that's something you're going to need to manage. When the project is done, you'll need to determine whether the newspaper will be recycled upon completion of the project or if they're going to return it to you. Well, if they are hosting the files, are they also going to maintain the digital preservation copies? Is there a cost for any sort of hosting or digital preservation of these files? And is this a one-time cost or is it ongoing? There are many, many questions, and many of the answers to these questions will depend on your individual circumstances, your resources, and your own needs, as well as your vendor's capabilities. Now, whatever you and the vendor decide, be sure to document it in a contract or an agreement so that you can both protect your interests. I will say one of the other benefits of using a vendor is that you're able to hold them to higher standards than if you were digitizing material in-house. So choose file formats wisely and ensure the long-term access and ability to digitally preserve the content. There's no spending valuable time and financial resources to digitize something that you'll not be able to access in the future. Now, these are the recommended technical specifications for digitizing newspapers based on the National Digital Newspaper Program's technical guidelines and specifications. Now, you may remember from the How to Pick Your Pixels webinar, we talked a lot about picking your file specifications. Now, the Library of Congress recommends uncompressed TIFF files for your preservation copies. If you're digitizing from either microfilm or black and white originals, you should be digitizing to 8-bit grayscale and avoid bitonal or the black and white scans because those can really reduce the accuracy of optical character recognition. If you're digitizing from color originals, they recommend 24-bit color digital versions. The goal is going to be between 300 and 400 ppi in terms of the resolution, and it'll just kind of depend on the individual paper and its letter sizing. You'll want it cropped to the edge of the paper, not to the edge of the text. You'll want to give it that kind of 1/4-inch border around it to make sure that nothing's cut off. And you'll want it deskewed if it's greater than 3 degrees of skew. And I mentioned before, but if the newspapers were microfilmed 2 pages at a time, you're going to want those split into separate page files. So you would want a TIFF per page, not a TIFF per frame. Now, again, these are for the preservation files. You will want a multi-page PDF for access copies. Now, when you're managing large numbers of files, it's going to be essential to name and organize them appropriately. Make sure that your file names are consistent and identifiable across your digitization project and institution. Remember, file names should be both human and machine readable with no special characters. I recommend using a standard identifier such as an OCL number or a Library of Congress control number to represent the newspaper in the file name. You should also record the issue date in an ISO date format, which is year, 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 month, month, day, day. This is going to help both with consistency, interoperability, and with sorting. Last, be sure to include leading zeros in your page sequence numbers for easier sorting. So just an example here, page 1 of the January 23rd, 1984 issue of the Canton Observer is going to translate to that OCLC number underscore the date underscore 001 for the page .tiff. Now, this is a common file naming schema for digitized newspapers, but it really doesn't matter what the file name schema is as long as it's documented and consistently applied. Now, the goal of any digitization project is to enable and improve access to material, so be sure to include a plan for providing access to your digitized newspapers. If you use a vendor to digitize your newspaper, you can often just have them provide hosting of that digital content. They often have access to higher quality or more robust tools than you might have available at your disposal if this isn't something that you do a lot. So just be sure to find out what their capabilities are, what the associated costs are, and if these costs are one-time or ongoing so that you can account for that in any budgetary or fundraising needs. Now, if your vendor does not provide hosting services or you choose not to have them host for whatever reason, you can explore hosting on a variety of other platforms or with other organizations. Now, the Clark Historical Library does host content through its DigMish News platform, which is an open access platform. And for those of you in the Upper Peninsula, the Uplink organization provides digital collections hosting of cultural records from Uplink members, and that includes newspapers. Both DigMish News and Uplink are also digitization vendors. They also do hosting. For those of you who might be familiar with LM Digital, which is the Library of Michigan's digital hosting service that we provide for other organizations, currently newspapers is the one format we do not host, but may in the future. If you don't want to go with any of those options, the Internet Archive is a great option that provides free hosting of digital content. The content is full text searchable and indexed by search engines, so you can increase discoverability of your newspaper content. Now, you can also host the files on your library's own website in a variety of different formats, and it really just depends on what your organization's resources are, what your needs are, and your technical infrastructure. No matter what, if your vendor does host your files, ensure that you receive a copy of the files and that you open them, that you can access them, and that they are not in any proprietary software that you would need your vendor to access. Remember, you are responsible for preserving and providing access to your digitized newspapers in the future, even if a vendor is helping you with that right now. I will reiterate that. Please always, even if you use a vendor, get a copy of your files, even if you won't ever plan to host them, so that if anything ever happens down the line, you can host them, and all the money and time and effort that you put into providing access to this material isn't wasted. I'll get off my soapbox now. All right, the last thing I'm going to do is talk about takedown policies. Takedown policy or takedown requests are inevitable when it comes to online content. So having a policy in place will help prepare you to handle one if and when a takedown request arises. Reminder that takedown policies should include what the request relates to. You should ask for either a content identifier or a URL. You should say who to contact and how, whether you provide an email address or an online form so you can let people know what the method of contact is, and then what the next steps are, the estimated response time, and what the results could be. This, of course, doesn't mean that you would take it down. It just means that there is a policy in place. Now, the University of Michigan's library policy page provides an excellent example of policies related to digital collections topics, including takedown policies for copyright and sensitive information. Now, these policies are there and they can be used as a reference for creating your own policy, though I would always recommend talking to your legal representative in order to finalize your policy. As always, you should also have an internal policy for how you handle any takedown requests you receive. All right, last section, funding opportunities. Newspaper digitization can be very costly. It can cost anywhere from 10 cents to 80 cents a page for digitization, depending on your desired outputs, whether it's just scanning or what format you're scanning to or how much metadata you're getting. Now, when considering years of a daily newspaper content, 10 cents might seem like a little, but it can add up very quickly. Now, luckily, you don't have to fund digitization projects all on your own. The CMU Digital Newspaper Grant Program funds digitization of Michigan newspapers every year, whether in print format or on microfilm. Now, this program covers either digitization and hosting of previously microfilmed Michigan newspapers, or microfilming, digitization, and hosting of a Michigan newspaper. You can see on the screen that you get slightly more done if it's been previously microfilmed. You get about almost 1,700 pages. If it's in print and they need to microfilm it first, you get fewer pages done, about 10,000 pages, but you get both the microfilm and the digitized version. Now, some of you may be familiar with the program. This program has been going on for many years, and in the past, it was a Twitter contest. You might be happy to know that the award process for this grant has changed. And starting in 2024, a committee of Clark Historical Library and Library of Michigan staff, plus a CMU faculty member, will review and select the winning applications. There should be 3 awards made this year, depending on whether it's microfilm or paper and the applications received. But this is going to be open for applications in January. So you can look on the website now, and there's a link to it in the resources page, but you can look at the application guidelines right now, start pulling together your materials, start getting your letters of recommendation together for that. But the application doesn't open officially until January 9th, and then it closes on January 31st. So I would highly recommend, if you do have newspaper in your collection that you're looking to digitize and you think is appropriate to digitize, to apply for this grant. Another alternative that I wanted to at least make you aware of is working with a content subscription provider. In this model, content subscription vendors digitize newspapers at no cost to a contributing library, but the access to that content is available only to the library within the library building and through the content provider's website behind a paywall. This is not an ideal situation, but it also isn't forever. There's usually an embargo period of 3 to 5 years, depending on the vendor. And this allows the content subscription vendor to recuperate their costs in digitizing the material. Because of course, this is behind a paywall and people are paying to access the content before your library is able to provide free and open access to the content. So again, it's not transferring ownership. You don't have the ownership of this paper in the first place for most part, but you are providing them the access to the physical material. So again, not an ideal option, but it is an option nonetheless. Besides this and the DigMish newspaper grant program, there are many other funding sources available, and the digitization page of the Library of Michigan website has an entire section dedicated to grants and funding opportunities aimed at digitization and preservation, including those offered to Michigan specifically, as well as regional opportunities. Now, aside from grants, you might need to think a little bit outside the box for ways to fund your digitization project. Fundraising partnerships with your library friends group, community crowdfunding, and courting private donors are some methods you're probably already familiar with, but I want to highlight something innovative that Peter White Public Library in Marquette did this summer. Now, to raise funds to digitize or continue digitizing the Mining Journal, they did a raffle and auction of local artwork from private collectors and artists in Marquette. And they were able to raise several $1,000s to put towards their ongoing newspaper digitization process. Now, another tactic to try is to partner with the publishers themselves. Local newspaper publishers often see the value of continued access to the history of their region and may not only provide licensing of any work still under copyright, but also funding to help digitize and preserve some of their content. And they're happy to work with you if you can be the stewards of that content. Remember, newspaper digitization is not something that needs to be completed all at once. Just because microfilm machines are breaking down doesn't mean the microfilm is breaking down. Many libraries have ongoing contracts with digitization vendors to digitize a certain amount of material annually, and that way they can get a little bit done at a time while staying under budget. Now, if a newspaper was relatively recently microfilmed and kept in suitable storage conditions, microfilm can last well into the future, and that gives you time to undertake the necessary research and preparation for digitization. And it also provides you with the resources and timelines you need to preserve these digital papers. All right. That is a lot for today. Just want you to remember a couple key takeaways. Always start by creating a detailed inventory or consulting a detailed inventory to make sure you know what you have. You should assess the title's copyright status and any associated risks for titles not in the public domain. You should digitize the best version negative, which is the second generation or print negative. Find the right digitization vendor. This is a partnership, and you should focus on those that can meet technical guidelines and have a history of working with cultural heritage organizations. You don't have to foot the bill on your own. There are grants and a lot of fundraising opportunities available to do this work, even though it can be expensive. And last, just remember that digitization increases access, but it also makes more for you to preserve. So please don't undertake this lightly and know that a lot goes into it, but you're not alone and there are many resources to help get you there. All right. Thank you. And please feel free to ask questions. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. Kim, yes, you raise your hand. You can either unmute yourself or put stuff in the chat.
Hi, Biz. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I was wondering if there is a specific location ever on the newspapers where you should be looking for that copyright mark. Because I have some papers from the 50s and 60s, and I've, kind of just randomly looked for the mark on different editions, and I cannot find one.
And it was pretty typical for them to not be there, and it's kind of hard to look for something that doesn't exist. But yes, they are in different places in different papers. Sometimes they are on the title page, sometimes they're around the kind of like notes to the editor page. So it's inconsistent, but those are kind of the main places or the places I would start looking.
Okay, I do see where it says the publisher's name at next to the title of the newspaper. And that's kind of where I looked first. I'll try looking at the notes to the editor page. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And sometimes it will be just the copyright symbol. Sometimes it will say copyright. Sometimes it'll be an abbreviation. So just to make it difficult, it's inconsistent in many, many ways. But a lot of times, especially with papers, before the 1960s, you're just not going to find it because it wasn't printed on the paper and it wasn't registered with the Copyright Office. So yeah, always look first at the paper to see if you can find it easily, but the Copyright Registry of Entries is a really good resource to check and see if something was registered or renewed, and it is full text searchable. I will say I get nervous, so I not only do I do the search, but I will just scroll through to make sure that I didn't miss it because, with all OCR, it's not 100% accurate and you don't want to miss something. So sometimes I will put different parts in, like if I know the publisher, I'll put the publisher in instead of the paper title, those sorts of things.
Okay, thank you. I'll do that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Any thoughts? Anyone have any newspaper digitization? Oh, yeah, James, go ahead.
Hi, Biz. This is James at the DIA.
Hi.
I have a large collection of scrapbooks that contain mostly newspaper clippings.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we've applied for grants in the past, some of the comments that come back suggest that we really would be in violation of copyright. And about half of the reviews come back saying, no, actually, we're in good shape. So it's a little bit of a puzzle because we would certainly argue that from a preservation standpoint, we really do need to do something with these news clippings.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not we can actually make them available, serve them on our dam system to the public. So any comments, or if anybody on the webinar would like to chime in, I'd love to hear your input.
Yeah, no, the feedback you're getting is right on both accounts. So just because newspaper articles are cut up doesn't mean that they're no longer covered under copyright protection. But there's also the added layer of the person who assembled that scrapbook now has copyright over that organization of materials. So it's a double copyright whammy because when they organize things, it makes their creatively creating something like that work. The scrapbook is a work. So the organization of the clippings is part of their intellectual property.
Right. Yeah,
Scrapbooks,
we kind of think of it as a derivative work.
yeah. With their scrapbook or with the newspapers, if you know where the articles came from, you could do an exhaustive copyright assessment. Like maybe it was all from the same paper. If it's the same person making the scrapbook, it might be, and tracking those down. It is a lot of work. I say that there is still a reason, especially because, the glue or tape in scrapbooks can be really harmful to that newsprint, and the newsprint itself is probably deteriorating. So digitizing the scrapbook itself is important, though whether or not you can provide access to it is another matter. Especially if you kind of look at what time period it's from. Do you know what time period the scrapbook book
Well,
materials is from?
we go back to 1882, but then we have them coming all the way up to probably 1998.
Mm-hmm. Well, you could probably digitize a lot of the older material and provide access to it if you know when it was from without worrying about copyright. If it was before, 1928, and then digitize for preservation some of the newer content and then make them available as you can do more research. But yeah, I would say digitizing them sooner rather than later would be ideal just in terms of the preservation component.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. If there are no more questions, button up. I just want to make sure you all know about the next webinar in the series, in the How to Pick series. In February, I'm going to be joined with Marianne Swerenga, who's the cataloging and metadata librarian at Western Michigan University. And she's going to be presenting how to pick your particulars, descriptive metadata for digital collections, where she's going to discuss how to describe digital collections and apply metadata standards. And thank you, Becky, for dropping the link to register in the chat. I also want to thank you all for joining me today, and to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for making this presentation possible. If you would please take just a second, it's only 3 questions. Take the survey to help me continue to improve our programming. And Becky just dropped the evaluation link in the chat. So thank you all for joining me today. I really appreciate it. You can contact me via email if you have any questions, but I hope that you all have happy holidays and safe travel if you're moving around.